I'm not sure it should be illegal, but it's certainly immoral and unethical.
Tell us a little bit about who Julian Assange today is.
So first of all, let me just say that I definitely have been an advocate and proponent of WikiLeaks from very early on.
Yep.
But we've also had a lot of differences, both private and public. The most prominent of which is that we had a very vociferous war over how Edward Snowden chose to disclose the documents that he thought ought to be disclosed about the NSA, which is he didn't just dump them all on the internet, nor did he give them to WikiLeaks.
He went to China and Russia.
He went to Hong Kong to meet with journalists and gave it to us and said, I don't want you to publish all of this. I want you to painstakingly review it all, withhold whatever might be damaging to innocent people, that might invade people's privacy, that might undermine or subvert legitimate surveillance programs, and only publish what's in the public interest. And pursuant to those instructions, even to this day, 6 years later, only a small portion of those documents that he furnished us have actually made their way to the public. We redacted a lot, we withheld a lot.
WikiLeaks put out pretty much everything, right?
Not of the Snowden. They've never gotten the Snowden materials.
No. Of the materials that they've had, I mean, yeah.
Right. So in the beginning,
their ideology is more towards
mass indiscriminate publication,
right.
And
Yeah.
I was very critical, for example, of how they published the DNC and Podesta emails with redacting none of it. It ended up that certain low-level employees had their mental health problems that were part of John Podesta's email chains discussed.
Should that be illegal?
I'm not sure it should be illegal, but it's certainly immoral and unethical. And
I mean,
I've
if
said
you're
that all the
causing
time.
that kind of damage and hurt to people.
I mean, I don't think publishing information should be criminal. I think that those people should have a right to sue. But I just want to be clear about the fact that yes, I'm a proponent on balance of what WikiLeaks has done for transparency, but we have very serious differences about how information ought to make their way to the public. When they began, they used to actually, they redacted a lot. People forget that the Iraq war logs, the Afghanistan war logs, the diplomatic cables that they published in its original form were heavily redacted because they worked with the New York Times and the Guardian. They actually asked the State Department to meet with them to talk about information that should be redacted. It only is recently that they began to be proponents of full-scale indiscriminate publishing. But even
what made the change? Why do you think they did that?
I think this is so important to realize about Julian Assange is he has been inside of a building for 7 years. That in a lot of ways is worse than prison because at least prisoners get to go outside for an hour a day and have the sun fall onto their bodies, which physiologically we need. Our bodies crave and require that. It's almost impossible to be a physically or mentally healthy person if you're never exposed to the sun. So for 7 years he's been trapped.
Kind of a nut.
I think that I wouldn't say that. I would say that that as you said, Julian is a complicated personality and always was. You probably have to be in order to say I'm going to purposely take on the most powerful factions and make them view me as my enemy. Right? That's not going to be a standard common personality archetype, right? Who becomes an accountant or an insurance salesman. So
accountant is here,
right?
And Julian is somewhere over here.
He was created to be a dissident.
Yeah.
But so in dissidents, I think it's kind of like just like, great artists or other people who achieve great fame and power, the very attributes that enable them to be extraordinary and in positive ways also generally produce very negative attributes as well. And I think that's the same for Julian. And I think the conditions under which he's suffered for the last 7 years, you can say it was his own choice. You can say it was because the U.S. was trying to persecute him, as we see now turned out to be true. The U.S. did want to extradite him and prosecute him for publishing crimes. Whatever the reason was, the conditions under which he suffered for the last 7 years have really exacerbated the worst parts of his personality traits.
So given what WikiLeaks does now, if you had the ability to say, I think that on balance they're doing a good thing or bad thing, not where they were 7 years ago, where they are now. On balance, you'd say?
On balance, I would absolutely say that they continue to perform a very positive role in the world. And I'll just give you the most controversial example and the most recent one, which is what they did in 2016. Notwithstanding the fact that I would not have published all of those materials, I would have gone through them and withheld them to protect
You're talking about
primacy of
the DNC, the Democratic,
DNC, yeah.
yes, which were turned out provided, again, we know from Mueller, by the Russians, trying to undermine.
Well, we don't know that WikiLeaks
election.
knew they were coming from the
We
Russians.
do not know that.
But we know, at least according to Mueller, that they did.
We know that Assange tried to obscure and hide and divert attention from where he got.
But
them
we
from.
don't know who gave Julian those documents or what he thought about who it was who was giving those documents to him. Obviously, one of the more despicable things he did was exploit the murder of Seth Rich. I don't think anyone could possibly defend that. I certainly would be the last person to do that.
Because he seemed to make it to imply that they came from Seth when he knew they did not.
Julian sees himself as an adversary of intelligence agencies and therefore views himself as using many of the same tactics that they use, which is necessary in his view to be a formidable adversary, one of which is the dissemination of disinformation.
So you break a few eggs. Oh well.
Like so many revolutionary leaders in history have done. But nonetheless, if you look at what those disclosures were, they led to the resignation of the top 5 officials of the Democratic National Committee because they proved that those officials were essentially violating their oath and lying to the public by pretending to be a neutral body overseeing the Democratic primary when in reality everything they were doing was designed to make their preferred
supporting Hillary
win.
As opposed to Bernie Sanders.
They also made CNN fire one of its most prominent commentators, Donna Brazile, because she got caught cheating by handing the Clinton campaign. So there's corruption there. There's information in the public interest. Also, speeches that Hillary Clinton is giving to Goldman Sachs and things she's telling Wall Street when she wants to be president. That's obviously in the public interest. And the proof of that is every major media outlet, not just The Intercept, NBC, The Washington Post, New York Times, dissected and analyzed and reported on those documents because they obviously all decided they were in the public interest, that they were newsworthy. So how can anybody say we would be better off not having seen information that every major editor of every major media outlet...
I take that point. That's not what I asked. What I asked was you look at the fact that you're better off with some of that information, but also the fact that a lot of lives were destroyed. And so
what do you mean by a lot of lives? You mean like the innocent people who...
had information.
The reality is there were kind of 3 categories. There was the newsworthy information. There was the totally banal, irrelevant stuff about John Podesta's risotto recipe that people use.
Yeah. Which was a horrible recipe, by the way. So that was clearly not in public
I haven't
interest.
tried it.
It was a horrible recipe.
And then there were a few documents that invaded people's privacy that I think shouldn't have been published. So I don't want to overstate. He didn't destroy huge numbers of people's lives. I think on balance, those leaks were good. I would have handled them differently. I would have protected innocent people who weren't powerful from having their privacy invaded. On balance, though, those documents, we were at The Intercept were the first ones to raise the issue of why is it that Hillary Clinton is getting paid $600,000 to give speeches to Goldman Sachs and refuses to tell us what she said to them while she's asking us to put her in the Oval Office and make her the most powerful person in the world. I think that was incredibly important to know what it was that she was telling Wall Street in secret, getting paid vast sums of money that most people have to work 10 years in order to make.
As it turned out, it was quite anodyne, but that's neither here nor there. That doesn't change your argument.
But it was interesting. I mean, she was, giving this really populist, anti-billionaire message on the stump, and then at the same time telling Wall Street with links that she regards them as important drivers of the economy. I mean, that disparity in public and private state. I'm not saying it's earth-shattering.
It wasn't earth-shattering.
It's not the Pentagon Papers. But, it's when someone's running for the most powerful position on the planet, the bar for what's newsworthy is pretty low. Like, we should err on the side of knowing more about those people than less.
So tax returns, for example, should be released to the public?
Here's the question that I have for everybody about all of this, which is, and I think there's a good chance this might happen. Let's say there's a country that hates Donald Trump. And there are countries like that. There's Venezuela, there's Iran, there's the Palestinians, there's Ukraine.
Sure.
And they get their teams of hackers, and all of them have hackers with various degrees of formidability, who hack into the Trump Tower organization and finally get not just Trump's tax returns, but all of his financial statements that show immense amount of criminality beyond what even his critics believe he did.
So let's imagine that the Russians actually disliked Trump as opposed to thought he would be the useful person.
Precisely.
Yes.
But it's Ukrainians or Venezuelans or Iranians. And they come to either the DNC or to the New York Times.
Sorry, it's not Ukrainians because Trump is actually helping Ukraine.
But now Ukraine has a different president who I think is more aligned with Russia than.
Let's not go there because I disagree. But okay.
Okay, we'll leave Ukraine.
You saw what Russia just did, right? You saw what Russia just did. You saw what Putin just did.
Yeah.
He provided citizenship.
Right, but I think that's in part because this new president wants to create a better data. But
I'll take the under on that.
That's way too complicated. Yeah, so let's just pick an example that we all agree: Iran. Or Venezuela.
Pretty clear.
Okay, we're good on that.
We're definitely good on that.
And they come in June of 2020.
Yes.
And they say,
they grab
I'm giving you these documents because I want Trump to lose.
Right.
I want to meddle in your election.
Yes.
And I have these incredibly explosive documents.
Yes.
Does anyone think that the Democratic Party or the New York Times or you either should or would say, like, I'm sorry, I don't want these documents. I don't believe in foreign meddling in the sacred American democracy.
I sure as hell wouldn't be publishing them. Let's make it clear.
You wouldn't?
Be publishing them if they were offered to me?
If they showed that Donald Trump was a criminal beyond, what if they showed that he was a member of an organized crime ring that had ordered people's murder, that he had engaged in loan sharking, things, you would conceal that information because it came from a foreigner and let him win without the American public knowing this incredibly incriminating information?
I take your point that a lot of journalists would publish that. I take your point.
I think a journalist would be breaching their most central duty if they didn't. And I'll give you a really good example. The New York Times dropped in the mail Trump's tax returns to David Barstow. Somebody literally just took it and put it in the Postal Service and sent it to the New York Times.
And we don't know where it came from, They
have no idea who did it, how they got it, whether they broke crimes in order to do it, or what their motives were. Could have been the Russians. Could have been anyone. They published it.
Different story, If you told me it just came as opposed to we knew it came from the Venezuelans, the Iranians, different story. I take your point.
I mean, the Pentagon, everyone knew the Pentagon papers were stolen, right? Daniel Ellsberg would have gone to prison for life had it not been for the misconduct of the Nixon administration breaking into a psychiatrist's office.
Correct.
So it was stolen. It was the byproduct of a criminal act. Should it have been published? I mean, I think that everybody more or less has a consensus now that we were better off knowing about the Pentagon papers. Same with the Snowden archive. I mean, there are people who will say they think we published too much. There's some people who say we published not enough. But I don't know of anybody almost who says we would have been better off not knowing any of that, including the fact that the U.S. government was collecting everybody's metadata and keeping records of everyone we were calling and with whom we were all communicating. It was stolen, though.
My point is simply that when you're talking about things that are clearly private and they are potentially stolen through criminal passages, there is culpability and vulnerability to being the person that suddenly makes a decision saying, I'm just going to put this all out there.
Oh, no, I mean, I don't think just Julian Assange. I think every journalist has the obligation to decide, and this is what we do every day, right, is we decide. I get information all the time, and my first question is, after figuring out if it's true, is this something that should be in the public? And a lot of times I make the decision, no, this is information that shouldn't be in the public. This is information that ought to remain private. Like I said, we withheld a huge amount of the Snowden archive based on exactly that assessment. So yeah, I agree entirely that if the information is information that's just private, meaning not in the public interest, it shouldn't be published. But I think you agreed before, or maybe you didn't, but I think a lot of people do, that at least some of what the Russians gave to WikiLeaks that they ended up publishing
would have been in the public interest.
Was newsworthy in the public interest.
Sure.